As Gene said, my name is Brian Collins, and I am at Cal Lutheran University, which is in Southern California between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. I just am in the middle of my ninth year here, which seems wild to think it's been that long already. My hope for this roundtable, I was just telling Gene and Haley that I unfortunately haven't been able to make it to the roundtables this year. So I'm not sure how everybody else has been facilitating it, but I really wanted to facilitate it as a discussion. So my initial remarks are going to be fairly short, and I had planned for them to be quite informal too, more conversational, not like a PowerPoint presentation. Something that's hopefully easier to listen to as we're talking about the virtue of listening. So that's the plan. And then I really want to open it up and hear your thoughts and practice this virtue that we're all trying to cultivate, this virtue of listening. So that's the plan. The title of the roundtable today is The Virtue of Good Listening. And I chose this because listening as a skill and a practice and a process is something that I am really interested in, partially, actually not partially, to a great extent, because I find that I'm not very good at it. I never have been great at it. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I think in the quote unquote West and in the United States, we're not great listeners overall. We're often paying attention to people or paying attention to things or reading things or looking at things with various motivations, but oftentimes it's not really to try to absorb everything. We're fragmented. We're listening for our own for some particular reason, or we're listening to somebody in order to respond to them. And I don't think that that's great listening. I also find myself, I'm what I describe as a slow thinker. I like to process internally before talking. And so as people are talking, oftentimes I find myself thinking about already whatever they're talking about. And then I realize, oh, I haven't heard what they just said the past 3 minutes. I also do this when I'm reading. So I'm reading something and I'll find myself drifting off. And I think that's the same tendency. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think it takes away from the listening, my ability to listen in the moment. So that's all to say, my interest in listening as a virtue and listening as a skill is because I've never felt like I'm great at it. And when I came across a practice that helped me develop the skills, at least a little bit, I was really intrigued. So let's jump to that. After graduating from St. Olaf College, I taught middle school for 3 years. And it was during my first year teaching middle school that I was introduced to this practice. And this was here in Los Angeles. And it's the practice that I've come to learn takes a lot of names. People call it lots of different things. Roughly, I think of it as a very similar practice. And it's the practice of sitting in circle and telling stories. I was introduced to it under the name counsel, but it really is called sometimes just circle work or circles or justice circles. There's lots of names for it. And it was that facilitation process that allowed me to, in some ways, see how poor of a listener I am most of the time, and simultaneously allowed a process and a way for me to really intentionally focus on my own listening and develop those skills. So that was something I learned when I was teaching middle school. I carried this with me then into grad school, didn't practice it in any overt or explicit way, except with friends that also knew the practice. And then when I started teaching my own courses as a professor, I tried to incorporate some of the process into our class discussions to a greater or lesser extent. Usually I didn't do it overtly. When I was fortunate enough to get a sabbatical, one of my goals in that sabbatical was really re-immerse myself in this practice of counsel, or sitting in circles and sharing stories, talking and listening. And so I did that during my sabbatical, and then since then have explicitly been incorporating it into all of my classes, because I believe that communication is really important. That's not too controversial to claim, but also that the most important part of communication is listening. I also don't think that's controversial, but maybe less people would come to that conclusion. Also, we're all really poor at it. And so one of the main things that I tell my students, and I want my students to work on and develop and get out of any class they take with me, is an increased or developed capacity to listen. Like I suggested earlier, I think this takes lots of forms. I think actually reading is an analogous process to auditory listening. It's trying to absorb or take in information. I think we can also do this visually. It's in some ways strange to call that listening, but I think they're analogous processes at work. And so we in my classes, every couple weeks or so, sit in circle and share. Sometimes this has nothing to do with the content that we're covering. Sometimes it is interwoven with the content. And the goal always is just to focus on the skills of listening simultaneously with sharing. So usually there's a talking piece or a physical object that we pass around. This is, as I describe it, a visual and a tactile reminder about who we're supposed to be trying to pay attention to. And I find that really helps, because our minds wander. And if we can re-engage and have other prompts and cues for who we're intending to give all of our attention to, I think that's useful. So that's, I'm happy to share more about the process and organizations that do similar things. But that's a little bit of background about why I'm interested in it, and or why I'm interested in the practice of listening, how my own development in this practice. I am by no means, I would say, a great listener still. I am continually trying to become better. And this process is one of the best ones that for me personally, in that skill development. To say a couple more things about why I see it as a virtue. I think listening is a capacity or an ability. It's also can be a habit that we form, how we engage. And so, to not get too much into the esoteric abstraction about what virtues are and what it means to say something's a virtue, roughly that I think listening is a capacity and ability and a habit that can be strengthened through practice. It's a skill that can be developed. Now, I just for a couple minutes tried to make a quick list of what other virtues I think are connected to or related to listening. And just in like 2 minutes, I was able to come up with a bunch. So I think curiosity is really intertwined with listening. To be a good listener, I think you have to be curious. If you're not curious, the motivational aspect of what you're trying to get out of listening seems to disappear. So curiosity is one virtue that I think is highly tied with listening. Humility is another. And patience is tied with that too. What I mean by that is, in order to really hear somebody, I think you have to be empathetic and generous and charitable and compassionate and respectful for them as an individual with their own experiences. So you're not just taking it in, you're not just taking in what they're saying. In lots of ways, you're trying to understand who they are and where they're coming from in order to understand what they're trying to say and communicate. That takes a lot of humility, to set down your own desires to say something, to set down or set aside your own immediate judgments about what they might be saying and just take it in. So curiosity, humility, patience, I've already said that, charitability, generosity, compassion, respect, courage. I think courage is tied to it too, maybe loosely. But I think it takes courage to not immediately respond to somebody, or even try to jump in and show that you also know what they're talking about. That takes a type of courage. And then one last one that I wrote down as far as virtues that are related is assertiveness. So in communicating with somebody, it is about listening and it is about speaking or writing, or communicating somehow. Assertiveness and deciding when to be assertive, when to form judgments, when to respond is a very difficult, I think, task, and one that requires a lot of practical wisdom, in order to discern and decipher, like, okay, what is the right time to respond, and how much do I respond, and what is the right amount to say or not say, and what all of these are wrapped up. So in a few short minutes that I was trying to quickly think of related virtues, what did I come up with? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like 10 virtues. I think that's telling, or at least that's telling for the way I think of it. I think listening is a practice that we're not very good at, but is so meaningful, or can be so meaningful, in lots of aspects of our lives, all relationships, closer relationships, but even distant relationships as well, people we're not in close relationships with. So that's what I wanted to say, to give a little background, who I am, why I'm interested in listening as a virtue, how I try to practice it, to increase my capacity as a listener, and also how I see it intertwined with some of the other virtues.